Michael, are you able to turn on your video?
Okay, I'm working on my presentation. Okay.
All right. I think we're ready to start. Let me start sharing. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this for our panel titled "The Racial Justice Dashboard: Pursuing Racial Justice Through Data in Europe and Latin America." We are very much looking forward to the conversation that will follow at the end of our presentation. To begin with, who are we? Today, four of us will be presenting to you. The Racial Justice Dashboard is a collaboration between the African Futures Lab and Data Pop Alliance. From Data Pop Alliance, we have Zinia Del Villar. And then from African Futures Lab, you have myself, Amaedo, and Liliane Mubiayi. And we are delighted and honored to be joined by Michael McEachran, who is an expert member and rapporteur in the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. All right. The general flow of our presentation today is that we will talk you through the motivations behind what the Racial Justice Dashboard as a project before digging into what the project entails and how we built it. What we're presenting today is a pilot, a first iteration of the dashboard that has raised a number of questions and illuminated the next steps for the development of this dashboard. And so we'll be, after giving you a general idea of what the project is, digging into the details of this pilot and opening up on the findings and the limitations and our next steps for how to build out this project. Today, four of us will be presenting to you. And so, without further ado, Michael, I will pass you the mic to open up the conversation about why we need racial data in the first place. And then from African Futures Lab, you have myself.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Amma. And thank you to both you and Lilian for inviting me. And I'm glad to be on this panel together with you and Xenia from Data Pop Alliance. So, yes, to answer the question, and this is the question of my brief presentation, why do we need racial data? To answer that question head on, we need it to measure, monitor, recognize, and through policymaking address systemic and structural forms of racial discrimination. If we can agree, which I'm hoping that this is what we need racial data for, then at least four conundrums seem to present themselves. Let me briefly explain each of them with a focus on the European Union and the United Nations. First, there really are no universally or otherwise widely accepted concepts and definitions of systemic and structural forms of racial discrimination, at least since Stokely Carmichael's, aka Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton's classic book from 1967, Black Power, the Politics of Liberation, the term institutional racism has been with us. During the 1980s and 90s, this term was largely superseded by the similar term structural racism. In recent years, this term has in turn been superseded, or at least complemented by another similar term, systemic racism, which is a term that was made popular by the Black Lives Matter movement and is now used at both the UN and the EU. If we stick with the terms systemic and structural racism, then how should we define and understand them? The groundbreaking report from 2021 by then United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the promotion and protection of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of African and African descent, understands systemic racism as, quote, the operation of a complex, interrelated system of laws, policies, practices, and attitudes within states institutions, the private sector, and societal structures that combine result in direct or indirect, intentional or unintentional, de jure or de facto discrimination, distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference on the basis of race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin. Although this may be a definition that we can work with, it does not give us clear guidance exactly how to master this complex interrelated system. Alternatively, in a chapter that was published last year, that I have suggested that systemic racism is an understanding of society as a social system which a consists of elements that are organized, amenable to human change, and may be subject to political decision making, including laws, policies, institutions, practices, norms, behaviors, and human relations. And B is racially, ethnically, and or in other related terms hierarchical or stratified, in the sense that some racial, ethnic, and or other related group or groups consistently is or are privileged, whereas others are consistently less privileged or disprivileged in their access to enjoyment or exercise of rights across areas of the social system slash society, and that these groups therefore and in this manner unequally enjoy or exercise human rights across areas of the social system slash society. I may be terribly biased, but for the purpose of offering guidance as to exactly what systemic racism is and how it may be measured, personally, I favor this definition over the previous one. In any case, I think it's fair to say that for the purposes of data collection, we do not have yet have any established definition of systemic racism or structural racism for that matter, although I will leave that matter aside for now. Second, there really are no well developed legal norms for recognizing and addressing systemic and structural racism. The European Union Race Equality Directive from 2000, which serves as the template for domestic and anti-racial discrimination across law across the EU, is limited to what it terms direct and indirect discrimination. Basically, direct discrimination is meant to cover interpersonal forms of discrimination in the interaction among individuals, whereas indirect discrimination is meant to cover the discrimination of an organization against against an individual or group of individuals. This does not include, for example, that certain racial groups may be consistently disadvantaged across areas of society. By contrast, the UN International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination from 1965 famously defines racial discrimination as, quote, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Although it is not uncontroversial, this may be, and I think should be interpreted as including discriminatory social conditions that lead to an unequal enjoyment of rights among racial groups. However, the ISOD was adopted before such terms as institutional, structural, and systemic racial discrimination were coined, and does not include an explicit and unequivocal recognition of these forms of discrimination. Third, there really are no well-established methods for how to use disaggregated data collection to comprehensively measure, monitor, and recognize systemic and structural forms of racial discrimination. For the production of the first EU report on people of African descent being black in the EU from 2018, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights tasked me with putting together a reference group group of 10 Black European studies experts. We met with the agency in Vienna to discuss the report and submitted comprehensive comments on a full draft of it. Among our sticking points was that although the report demonstrated that people of African descent suffer racial discrimination across areas of society, it failed to describe this in terms of structural racial discrimination. Since then, the agency has been less reluctant to use such terms as systemic and structural racial discrimination, although, as they will readily admit, they are still struggling with how to define such forms of discrimination and use data collection to recognize, measure, and monitor them. Fourth, there really are no well-established methods or guidelines for how to use disaggregated data collection in policymaking to address systemic and structural forms of racism. Still, there are several initiatives at both the EU and UN around addressing discrimination that could be elaborated on and applied for recognizing and addressing systemic and structural racism. For example, the EU Roma Strategic Framework from 2020 calls on states to use data collection both to monitor the human rights situation of Roma and to set up measurable policy targets for addressing disparities and follow up the effects of policies with more data collection. The European Commission has also called for equality mainstreaming, so-called equality mainstreaming in policymaking, such that takes into account its effects on discriminated groups and includes measures to ensure their equal enjoyment of rights. However, we still have some ways to go before racial data can be used in the EU to unequivocally and comprehensively recognize and address systemic and structural racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this framing and for bringing us to the definitions and the discussions around the definitions, as well as the need for tools and guidelines for how to use these tools and how to use data. From there, Liliane Mubiayi is going to extend on the discussion of why we need a racial justice dashboard. Liliane?
EU Roma Strategic Framework from 2020 calls on states to use data collection both to monitor the
Liliane, I think you're muted.
Roma and to set up measurable policy targets for addressing disparities.
Sorry. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Sorry for this.
The European Commission has also called for
before maybe presenting the racial justice dashboard and the logic behind this project, maybe I would like to start by presenting the reasons for which we decided as an organization at African Futures Lab to engage in this project. And what I would like to say on that is that one of the core of our mission is to hold states, private state institutions and private actors accountable for racial injustices, historical and contemporary, by exposing these injustices, but also by supporting other actors in their quest for justice. And one of the biggest challenge that we face that we encounter in that mission is the fact that racial injustices in the context that we operate in Africa and in Europe are invisibilized. And one of the ways through which they are invisibilized is the fact that, as it was mentioned, that race data are not collected in the large in many countries in the world. The racial justice dashboard. There are in many countries don't collect data, or they collect them in a very partial way. Which we decided as an organization, and despite the multiple calls from the UN, from the EU, some of the countries, as you know, still, for instance, like France, still forbid the fact of collecting data. So for us, that has been like one of the biggest challenges, because if we want to tackle the lack of accountability, we have to base our analysis and our arguments on data and solid data. And in addition to that, what we observe also in the multiple contexts is that racial injustices, racial violence has been is most of the time considered as an isolated experience. It's individual experiences, individual discriminations, and in that way, we are not able to see what Michael Crane was addressing or highlighting of the systemic nature of the inequalities, the systemic nature of the violence, and the magnitude of the violence. And for us, this is highly problematic because we're not able to understand how we're not able to understand and prove how the differences are maintained through institutions, through the policies, whether it's in inequalities in terms of distribution of resources, whether it's inequalities in terms of access to these resources or in terms of balances. And it was fundamental for us to find ways in which to circumvent these obstacles, because we know that as the different hurdles that Michael Crane has highlighted are not going to be sidelined very easily. So we have to find, as a civil society organizations, means through which we find temporary solutions to collect data, but also to use opportunities that some of the methods that exist now can expose this systemic dimension, this structural dimension, and that's one of the key aspects of this dashboard that we will share. But the possibility to use quantitative data, but also to resort to a big data analysis. We're not able to understand and prove how the differences are maintained.
Great, thank you, Viviane. And so, as has been highlighted by both Michael Crane and by Viviane Moubiei, the imperative of collecting racial data or making racial data available is to make visible the scope and the presence of and the nature of racial violence, specifically in contexts where data is not being collected, where it's forbidden to be collected, or where it is being collected by the state, it is inadequate or insufficient. And so this racial justice dashboard that we are developing is an attempt to address these gaps in contexts where we've made these observations in Europe and in Africa. So we have Europe and Latin America, my apologies. So the dashboard has three goals. The first being to, as we've been saying, to bring more visibility, right, to the state of racial injustices, because having this evidence is the first step towards attaining or pursuing justice. The second goal is that having this tool, having this data makes it possible to develop policies that address the harms that are being that are made visible, right? So that this data becomes a tool for evidence-based policymaking. But the idea is that it not only serves policymakers, but that it supports activists and advocates also in designing their strategies, right? So the idea is that this resource becomes or is of use at all levels in order to make visible the problem and articulate specific demands, as well as design responses to address the systemic racism that is being made visible. And so this racial in our vision for what the dashboard will do, its scope geographically would be global, ideally. All of this is resource dependent, certainly, but our idea is to provide a perspective that spans the globe. But as we've been saying, with an emphasis on areas where aggregate racial data is harder to attain or is just simply not available. thematically, we have a number of topics that we have identified that we would like to work on. So today we'll be presenting you our first pilot, which is on public discourse in the media. Some two other topics that we are looking forward to developing have to do, one with environmental racism and the ways that racialized populations in Europe and in Africa in particular are differentially impacted by climate change and by other forms of environmental harm. We're also working on a project, or we'll be developing this project on Black women's access to healthcare. There's a great deal of data that shows the uneven access to healthcare, uneven health outcomes, health quality of health services for, again, racialized populations and Black women in particular in other regions in the world, namely in the Americas, in the United States. And we are very much looking forward to bringing these questions to bear on the European context also. But for today, the project we're focusing on is the one on public discourse and the media. And this is thematically, we have a number of topics that will tell us a little bit more about identified that we would like to work on. So today we'll be presenting you our first
how does the
pilot,
racial
which is on
justice
public
dashboard
discourse and media.
work? First of all, we will
Two
focus
other
in the
topics
sources
that
of
we are
methods.
looking forward
We
to
will
developing
use a
have to
mixed
do,
method
one
approach
with
that consists
environmental racism,
on quantitative
and the
and
ways that
qualitative data.
racialized
Inside the
populations
quantitative
in
data,
Europe
we divided
and
into
in Africa
traditional and
in
non-traditional
particular
data.
are
We don't have an
differentially
exhaustive definition of
impacted
what is
by
traditional
climate
and
change and by
non-traditional
other
data, but in
forms
general
of
terms,
environmental
traditional
harm.
data
We're also working on
will
a
be the
project, or we'll
data
be
created
developing
and
this
collected
project
by
on Black women's
humans, and
access to
non-traditional
healthcare.
data, the data
There's
collected
a
and
great
created
deal
by
of data that
machines.
shows the
So in
uneven
this sense, for
access
example,
to
big data is
healthcare,
part of
uneven
non-traditional data.
health outcomes,
For
health
the
quality
racial
of health,
dashboard,
of
the
health
traditional
services
quantitative data
for, again,
will
racialized
be
populations and Black women in particular in
that
other
we will
regions in the
use.
world, namely
Will be
in the Americas, in the United States.
surveys and
And
public
we are very much
census
looking forward
by
to bringing
country.
these questions to bear on
And
the
non-traditional
European
data,
context also.
we have different data
But
sources
for
that,
today,
for
the
example,
project we're focusing
we
on
will
is the
use
one on
GPS
public
data,
discourse and the
GDL data
media.
that I will talk in detail
And this
in the
is
next section, Google Trends data,
what
and the social network data, for example, Twitter
will tell us a little bit more about now.
and the part of qualitative data to contextualize the results that we can have with the quantitative analysis. We will have the key informant interviews, and we have a set of different methods of analysis according to the data sources that we are analyzing. For example, text and sentiment analysis, event and trend analysis, geospatial analysis, spatial temporal analysis, and another type of data analysis that we will be using. Next one, please. About the limitations of working with non-traditional data sources, we can highlight some of these limitations that are the most important. For example, the algorithmic bias that we will talk in detail in the next section too. Sampling bias that consists on the representativeness of minorities, and this representativeness consists of the digital gap of some subpopulation or some parts of the population, the data quality issues related to this digital gap, the lack of context. That's why we include this part of qualitative methods, and the lack of transparency. That, in general terms, this is related to the black box of the algorithmic. That sometimes we don't know exactly what the algorithms are doing, because we don't have enough information about the results. Yes, I give you the floor for the next part that we will present our discourse. Next one, please.
Yes, so Liliane, will you talk us through the why race and public discourse for this first pilot?
We can highlight some of these limitations that are the most important.
For the first research question or research. They are now the first topic that we wanted to start with in this project was on the racial discourse, and we decided to focus on this topic because over the last couple of years, we have seen that that the media has been a fertile breeding ground for the development of racist discourse. On one hand, I'm sure that you are aware of the multiple examples on Twitter and Facebook and others, but at the same time, we have seen that it has been also a space of contestation where demands and claims were articulated, were taking shape. So for us, it was a very interesting laboratory to observe the racial dynamics and the trends in different countries, but also over time.
Yes, so
and we wanted to start with that with this question and to monitor what is happening, what is happening in the different countries. So the main goals. So the main goals here with this first analysis is to be able to create a barometer of the opinion on racial inequalities or racial injustices, but at the same time use a comparison between different countries to see like what are the trends, what are the similarities, what are the points of convergences, but also to being able to identify events that are going to provoke shifts in the public discourse. So that's what we have been trying to develop at this stage. And Zinia, I give you the floor to go into detail on that.
Thank you, Lilian. First of all, we select two different regions, West Europe and Latin America, because the different racial backgrounds and historic process. And secondly, inside each region, we select, for example, Colombia in Latin America, Colombia and Brazil. In this region, in general, in all the countries of Latin America, we have existing census data on race and ethnicity, and this is very important, and institutional and intersectional coordination to collect data on race. Particularly, Colombia is an exemplary approach to data collection for minority groups. And for example, Brazil, more than a half of the population self-identify as Afro descendants, but still they are accounting as a minority population.
But also
in the other region, we select France and the UK. These both countries had a wide variation in the race data collection practice. For example, in UK, we find a well-established program for collecting data on ethnicity, and in France, in the opposite, it's illegal to collect race data. So that's our geographic scope. And I will share with you our first results of this pilot that we analyze the public discourse through GDELT. First of all, I want to explain you what is GDELT. GDELT is an open free platform, GDELT project, that has a collection of that has a database collection of over 7.5 billion of news articles, updated every 15 minutes to be around the world, over 100 languages. For the purpose of this project, we use the GDELT event database, which captures more or less 60 attributes of each event. About attributes, I would say characteristics of each event, that is, for example, the location, the author, the topic, the source, the emotions, etc., etc. The methodology that we use to analyze this GDELT database, first of all, we use a query to filter the event that we like, that we want to analyze. In this case, the event was with a keyword, this filter, that is Black Lives Matters or George Floyd. The time period that we use to filter the events that we analyze was from January 2019 to March 2023. And our geographic scope was global, that is, this will analyze all the articles, all the volume of articles that were created, was UK, France, Brazil, and Colombia. We have a pool of related keywords according to the language of each country. For example, in English, the queries were Black Lives Matter or George Floyd. In French, we add Les vies noires comptent. In Portuguese, vidas pretas importan, vidas negras importan. And in Spanish, las vidas negras importan. The research questions for these queries were related about how has the media coverage of George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter movement changed over time, and what are the implications of this change. So first of all, we can see this first graph that, thank you. We can see this first graph. In the axis X, we find the timeline, and in the axis Y, we find the volume of articles in terms of percentage of articles in that topic, in the query that we filter, divided by the total of articles available in GDate. So the first finding is that the publications, 10% of all the publications around the date of the George Floyd killing were talking about that. So this is more or less around the May 25 that you can see this volume. Okay. The next slide, we can see the average tone. First of all, I will explain you how GDelt calculate this average tone or sentiment analysis in terms of data science. The GDelt sentiment analysis is based on a dictionary that uses the sharer's type of affective state, STAS. This STAS is a list of words, and this list of words each word has a score of positive or negative. So, for example, good, great, step forward will be positive words, and in the other side, in the opposite, anarchy, awful, abnormal will be negative words. So, for an article, we will see the score resulting from the balance between positive and negative words, and this divided by the sum of all the words in that text. The score ranks between minus 100, that is extremely negative, to plus 100, that is extremely positive, and but in general, in articles or in large text, we have this tone or sentiment analysis between minus 10 to plus 10. So here, for example, during the George Floyd killing, we can find the negative sentiment around minus 6. That it was the more negative sentiment through the time in around the world. If we go in detail for each country, we will compare, for example, UK versus France. The next one, thank you. And in this case, in black, blue, you will have the average tone. In red, you will have the volume. So here in the volume, you will see exactly the event of George Floyd killing. And the left side, you will have the scale of the volume, and in the right side, you will have the scale of the tone. So In the left side you have UK, in the right side you have France. The tone becomes more negative as the volume in the moment of the event of George Floyd killing. We will see the tone more negative than before. So we have an before and an after George Floyd killing, and the tone remains more negative in the UK before George Floyd killing, and in France, for example, we can see a gradually improving. So this becoming more positive, this became more negative, but this is improving the tone in France. Thank you. And in this case, then a second query that we use for our research was related to the word racist, or with the base of the word racism, that is end racism, racial discrimination, racial inequalities, microaggression, black people racism, people of color racism, or that is all the related words that we have with racism, of course, translated to the core language that we were working on, the same time period, the same geographical scope, but now our research questions were related about the coverage or related topics changes depending on the political leaning or partisanship, right, center, left, of the media. This is very interesting because in each media we can see a different tone and a different words that we can show in the next slide. So first of all, the methodology to create this was to generate a list of top 10 media outlets publishing articles related to the query racism in each country. From this, we select 3 media outlets in each country with different political leanings, right, center, and left, measured by external sources, for example, all sides. We calculate the tone, the average tone, sentiment analysis of the articles published by these journals. And finally, we looked at the most common keywords used by each media outlet. So the results were available for UK, France, and Brazil, not from Colombia. And we decided to focus and to present to you now only France and Brazil. So in the next slide, you can see in the left side of France, in the right side Brazil. So for each country, you have in the left, the lean left, the center media, and the right and the far right. For France, in the lane left, we have the journal Humanité, Dolce Vele in the center, and Sputnik News in the far right. From Brazil, we have in the leaflet Blog da Cidadania, in the center, The Guardian Brazil, and in the right side, Gazeta do Povo. So the first finding that you can see directly is about the average tone. So in both countries, the most neutral media use a significantly more negative tone than the left and the right wing media. So, for example, in France, the Dolce Vele has an average tone of 110, and the right and left media about approximately 1.5. In Brazil, we have an average tone in the media of the center of -5, and the average tone of lean left of -1, and on the far right of -2. Another important result about these journals is, for example, that in France, the left media covers issues of conservative figures. For example, Marine Le Pen. You can see directly Marine Le Pen in the cloud words. And vice versa, for the right-wing media, the journal covers the journalist Taha Buhas. And in the center, Dolce Vele, we use more academic and progressive words or terms, but Dolce Vele, for example, human rights, war crimes, migrant workers, racial bias. Unfortunately for Brazil, we can't we can't see directly these patterns. But France is a good example of how we can look for. And the right and left media. Okay, thank you. About approximately in one. So some of the limitations that we have using this database or this type of analysis is that first of all we have an algorithmic bias. Another important result. This bias is related with the journals with the list of words that we are using, that is a general list of words, a general sentiment or general average tone that we are using. The second one is with a language bias. Articles are mostly in English. Nuclear funding with open questions. Of course, text mining, we need to be very, very careful about the type of questions that we are, the research questions that we are asking to this type of data, and incomplete GDL media coverage, and local specificities of media coverage. But we can have some mitigation strategies. The first one that we think about it is train algorithmic models to decolonialize algorithms. For example, create a racial dictionary adapted to the topic that we are working on and adapted to the type of words that the media use. So, conduct sensitive analysis or intercoder reliability tests. Contextualize our findings through qualitative methods, interviews, discourse analysis of specific articles or most important articles, for example, use of other data sources, for example, Twitter. Now I know that we have a lot of problems of access to Twitter, but we have another option of CrowdTangle. Well, we need to have the access to these databases, but there are other options to complement this analysis and compare these results in different locations and assess validity. So that are our preliminary results.
Great, thank you so much, Dinia. And I just wanted to do two things. One, to emphasize some of the points that Dinia raised about the limitations of that have emerged in this first iteration of the project. And then the second thing is to kind of take a bunch of steps back and come back to the overall aims of the project and where this experience leaves us in terms of how to grow it out and how to do it in a way that is true to its original mission. So as is highlighted here, these questions of algorithmic bias and language bias show us that as much as we need, as we brought up at the beginning, we need this large-scale data in order to make a case about racial violence. And yet what we find is that the tools, the data itself contains, right, both the data and the means of collecting it and the means of interpreting it very often contains the very violence that it is that we're trying to address. And so it leaves us in the situation where we both need the tools and we can't take them for granted and we can't take them at face value. And this leads us to, a finding, a conclusion that we know, and that bears repeating, right? Which is the fact that the technological work can't happen independently from the political work, because at every level of the process, from the questions that are selected to where we look for data to how we make sense of it, all of that requires a deep understanding of the issues that we're facing, right? And of the expressions and the manifestations of racism in every context that we're working in, right? Because the terms that matter, the actors that matter, the publications that matter, all of that is deeply specific knowledge for each case, right? And so as we develop a tool that is meant to provide large-scale visibility on an issue in particular spaces, we need both the technical expertise and the context-specific expertise of the politics and the question of race and racism in that issue. And we need a lot of creativity to figure out, okay, well, how do we get around the challenges that emerge or that exist in these different contexts that we're trying to address? And to to return to the very beginning, what I failed to make explicit at the beginning of that in the introduction is the fact that the collaboration is between two, the collaboration for the dashboard is between our two organizations, African Futures Lab and Data Pop Alliance. African Futures Lab being a civil society organization based in Brussels that pursues the recognition and reparation of racial harms, both contemporary and historical across Europe and Africa. And we do that by developing tools to support advocates and activists, as well as policymakers in their pursuit of justice. And Data Pop Alliance being a data science organization that seeks to address social problems, urgent social problems through data. And so the idea is to bring precisely these two different types of expertise that I've been talking about to bear on the question of racial violence in contexts where data is difficult to achieve. And so another kind of point or approach to mitigating some of the challenges that we've raised to us is the question of participation, right? So in addition to doing this technical and political work, as two entities or two organizations like us, like ours, the other part is that it's critical to involve the populations that this tool is meant to serve in the process of growing it, of developing it, and of course using it. And so the next step in our vision for the dashboard is that as we collect data and start interpreting it, the next step are what we call mobilization labs, which bring together actors engaged on these questions of racial justice to both look at the data with us, right? So to both look at what we're finding, look at the beginnings of our interpretations, support, kind of tell us what they're seeing, right? So that their expert knowledge is fed back into the tool in order to refine it. Also, so that they name the questions, the research questions that are most relevant to their mission and their justice goals, which can then again be fed back into the dashboard. And of course, that they can use this data to advance their missions, right? So whether they're advocates and activists or policymakers. And so for us, the development of the technical tool is meant to constantly be in conversation with the work that's happening on the ground to pursue racial justice. And I think that's one of the key findings that has emerged through this first pilot is again, it's something that we know, but something that is important to that we kind of keep learning over and over again is just the way that we can't think these technical tools exclusively of the humans that are behind them and that we intend to have these tools serve. With that, I would like to thank all of our presenters. Thank you, Xenia, Liliane, and Michael. And I would like to invite you in our audience to please bring us any questions you might have that we might, any clarifications you might be able to provide on what has been shared so far, any feedback, questions, any of the above. See if there's anything in the chat or in raised hands. And of course, that they can use this data to advance. And if not, I think we have a question or two amongst ourselves. Okay, I think we might start there. Is meant to constantly with our own questions. With the work that's happening on the ground for us, Michael, I think that has emerged through this first pilot. The first, without putting you on the spot, you did this really wonderful framing to open us up on the challenges of defining, of just naming, not defining, because there are definitions as you showed, but like of it being systemic racism being recognized and named and taken on by namely by the EU. And so we're curious about the extent to which you see a tool like a racial justice dashboard supporting the fight that you and for instance, the UN Permanent Forum on People and African Descent, the extent to which a tool like this can support the work that that you all are doing. Chat or in raised hands. And if not,
thank you for that, Amma. So, yeah, you know, the concept of a racial justice dashboard is definitely one that would be relevant. I think highly relevant even to civil society across Europe,
putting you on the spot,
and also policymakers.
You did this really wonderful framing to open us up.
I do think though that you know,
the challenges of
needs
defining,
to be
just
developed,
naming, not defining,
and
there are definitions, as you
and
should,
then
but
the
like
data needs to focus, if possible, on areas that are of great significance to people's everyday lives.
And so we're curious,
you know, such as employment,
the extent to which
housing, healthcare,
you see a tool
access
like a racial
to
justice dashboard,
education, and these sorts of areas.
The fight that,
and there's a bit of a trend, if you will, in the EU to reduce issues of racism to, for instance, hate speech and hate crimes and these sorts of things. And an issue with that is that you know, these sorts of issues you know, could be understood, and I think should be understood merely as symptoms of underlying deeper systemic and structural issues that affect people's everyday lives and well-being. But yes, I do think it would be helpful. And I know in the US there are some civil society actors that have very similar ideas and even you know, similar names. So there are similar initiatives with similar names, calling it a racial equity dashboard and so forth. So you might also want to connect with these actors and see if you can maybe work together and create synergies around this.
In the EU to yes, thank you for that, Michael. Absolutely, for highlighting the range of questions that the one trap that one might fall in is to reproduce the shadow areas, let's say, in the way that race is being talked about by institutions. And I very much appreciate your point about making sure that the research questions are like speak to folks' everyday experiences, which is absolutely the vision of for the dashboard after this initial pilot or beyond this initial pilot. But I think your second point is also really important about the value of working across regions, right? So across regions where there is a lot of data available and also a lot of systemic racism happening, and so to work across these regions to refine and develop these tools.
So there are similar initiatives with similar
Liliane,
names.
Do you have a point? Yes.
Yeah, I have a more question or comment on that because we have interacted with the Michaela Moi on this question, who is the EU coordinator on issues of racism, and she also advised us to look at this question of employment, education. But one of again, the biggest challenges, like we are in a context where data is not collected, so we have to find ways, like what is, if we consider the resources that we have now on this project were non-existent, but how do we manage to start with something that can show how important this project is, and then progressively address some fundamental questions. And that's why we show the issue of environmental racism and the Black women's access to health.
Is a lot of data available,
but maybe beside that, the question that I would address you is more like, how do you see in your position as the member of the UN Permanent Forum of People African Descent, how do you see this advocacy on the process of collecting data for states? How do you, where we know that the calls have been on the table like for many years, so is it something that is going to continue? Is it something that you think that we have to find ways to circumvent that obstacle because the hurdles are huge? Yeah, data is not collected, so we have to find ways like what is if we consider the resources that we have now on this project were non-existent, but how do we manage to start with something that can show how important this project is, and
thank
then
you,
progressively address
Lillian.
some
So yes,
fundamental questions, and
to
that's
your
why
to
we
your
show
first
the issue
point,
of
I do recognize
inventory
this
racism
problem,
and the Black
and so
woman's access to
as member states do not collect
but maybe beside that,
data disaggregated
the
by
question
race,
that I would
then
address
it
you
makes
is
it
more like
difficult
how do you see
to collect
in your
data for a
position
dashboard
as the member of
on
the UN Permanent
in
Forum
such
of People of
areas
African Descent, how
as
do you see this
employment,
advocacy on
for
the
instance.
process of
And this
collecting
is
data
where,
for
and
states?
this is a
How do you
resource issue,
where
but
we know that the
this
costs
is
have
where
been on the
I think
table like
maybe what would
for many
be
years.
needed for a
So
project or
is it
initiative like
something that is going to
yours,
continue? Is it something
long
that
term,
you think
is
that we
that you
have to
build the
find ways to
capacity. And
circumvent
I
that obstacle
recognize
because
this needs
the
a
hurdles
lot of
are
financial
huge?
resources to do this, but
Yeah.
you build the capacity to do your own surveys and your own studies, data collecting studies, and so forth, where you could use a relatively small sample size that could, be picked out in such a way, and that can be analyzed, scaled up, statistically, and so forth. There are methods for this, and the European Agency for Fundamental Rights uses such methods themselves. So this is possible, but you will probably need more resources for this. Then, yes, indeed, data collection is part of the mandate of the forum, and this is something that we will be working on in the future, and the preliminary the preliminary conclusions and recommendations that came out of the first session of the forum, which was held in Geneva in December last year. Among our recommendations was one on data collection, that where we urge UN agencies, funds, and programs to collaborate closely with the Permanent Forum to expedite the development of disaggregated data collection practices, analysis, and evidence-based projects on people of African descent and their intersectionalities. We and this is something that is in the making, so to speak. And then we also had a recommendation on systemic and structural racism, where we recommend the development of official UN guidelines and a handbook for a comprehensive human rights based and data driven approach to recognizing and addressing systemic and structural racism against people of African descent. And so hopefully we will have the opportunity to pursue these sorts of initiatives. And the second session, which will be held in New York the 30th of May to the 2nd of June, has as one of its five themes and thematic panels data collection on for systemic and structural racism. So this is very much on our agenda and is something that we look forward to developing in the future. On people of African descent and the intersectionalities.
Thank you very much, Michael and Liliane. We have just a couple more minutes, and I wanted to again see if there are other questions or comments in the audience.
Where we recommend the development of official UN guidelines and a handbook for a comprehensive human rights based and data driven approach.
So Mario asked, did you identify the existence of other racial dashboards coming from a civil society initiative?
And so hopefully we will have the opportunity to pursue these sorts of initiatives.
Xenia, I don't know if if you'd like to speak to this.
Which will be held in New York, the 30th of May to the 2nd of June.
Oh, I
It
think we're
has
being.
as one of its five themes and thematic
Oops, I think
panels
we're being.
data collection
Yes.
on
Oops, there's a question.
for systemic and structural racism. So this is very much
this
on
microphone.
our agenda.
Okay. My question is, if you're collecting data from Twitter or other social media, are you taking a risk of exposing people because this data could be circulated, even if aggregated? Sometimes you still might have risks there.
In the audience?
Yes, of course. At this moment in the results of GDELT, we have only articles and the authorship of these articles. If we use Twitter, for example, as we used before these new regulations that passed Twitter, we were able to know exactly who were the authors, for example, of campaigns of different campaigns or retweets, etc. We can know who are the authors, but this is not part of our interest of research questions at this moment. We were only looking through the time the hashtags that we create, for example, in the same way of GDELT.
My question is,
so the idea was to see to see the sentiment, to see
because this data could be
the way this hashtag, for example, is working through the time, the volume of tweets that we have through the time. So as we are analyzing at this moment this type of data, we are not looking for the authors. Then if we have another research question in the future, for example, about fake news or campaigns that are coordinated. In this case, we need to see who is the author or who or where it is based this first Twitter, to see if it is a bot or if it is a person. And in that sense, we will need to go in detail about the authors and the profile of the persons. But these are, this is data that is open because each person authorized that their tweets are open. So this is regulated with this regulation. Sorry for the words inside the Twitter application API for the Twitter the tweets that we are analyzing. As we are analyzing at this
maybe
moment,
to add just a comment on that, I think the overall standard our overall standard in terms of like exposing people is that if we have to share something outside of our internal process, we will anonymize. So I think it's we make sure that people are not exposed in what they have may said. So we have information inside, but we make sure that it's not shared into the outside world.
This first Twitter, to see if it is a bot or if it is a person, and in that sense, we will need to go
unless there is another question. Thank you for that question, by the way. And unless there is another question, I see that it's 8:33 Brussels, 2:33 Beijing. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I put in the chat, although I don't know what that means for the screen, the addresses for both of our two organizations, where you can find our contact info. And I think we are all eminently Googleable also. So
maybe to
please do feel free to reach out with any further questions or queries. Again, I'd like to thank you, Michael McKee-Crane, for joining us today and for helping to anchor our project. And we look forward to continuing this work. Thank you for the kind.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a great one.
Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you.